As you heard, what we're covering today is the cover letter, but it's hard to talk about cover letters without also talking about resumes because the two documents sort of go hand in hand. They're sort of part of the same package and they do different things, but they're there for a similar purpose, which is to get people excited about you as you're applying for some of these consulting roles. I'm going to touch on both aspects of this as we go through. So as you heard, I'm the Director of Graduate Career Initiatives at Penn's Career Services. I oversee the two teams of advisors that support graduate students and postdocs. So here's what I'm going to cover today. I'm going to start off with some resume tips because, as I said, you need to have a solid foundation for resumes, for cover letters to work effectively. We're going to sort of briefly explore who actually reads cover letters and why, and what are they going to do with that. Then we're going to sort of go into the cover letter tips, finish up with those resources that I mentioned. So here are the resume tips, and these all sound a little bit cryptic, when I state them like this, but hopefully it will make sense as we go through this. So does your resume actually sound like you? Right? It's a key aspect of what you're trying to do, and I'll explain why. Have you quantified things and have you qualified things? Do you know what your main takeaways are from your resume? How can you review every bullet point that you've written, and how can you use AI? This is what we're going to cover in 5 sort of quick steps out there. So number 1, does your resume sound like you, or does it sound like your work? I review many resumes as part of my role, and so I've seen the whole spectrum of how people describe their work. And this is a sort of a good example of, a resume that is designed to sound impactful. Because it uses a word that I think is only used in resumes, which is spearheaded, right? I spearheaded a project. So the question I would ask anyone, looking at your resume is, if you were to read your resume out loud, does it sound like you? And the reason why that's important is because when you submit your resume, someone's going to get excited about that resume and they're like, this is someone I want to interview. And then if you get to an interview and you are a sort of a different version of yourself than your resume, right? In the interview, you never talk about spearheading and executing things, or you never use language that feels this sort of formalized. You're going to create a disconnect. The recruiter, the hiring manager is going to say, wait a minute, this doesn't quite match up, right? The person I'm speaking with doesn't sound like the resume. And you shouldn't sound like this resume, right? Because again, spearheaded, executed, they're kind of vicious words. Orchestrated, right? These aren't words that are helpful as part of a normal conversation. The one word that's perhaps different from these is this idea of cross-functional, right? Especially if you're applying for industry roles, you might see this in a job advert, right? It says we need someone who can work in a cross-functional environment. So it's good to try to use some of that language. However, if you describe your work as a researcher, as a PhD student in a lab as cross-functional, you're not really using it in an accurate way, and it still doesn't quite sound accurate because that's not how research is described in that setting. Now, if you worked as an intern, you might be able to get away with that because you might be on a team that sort of does that it works cross-functionally with the marketing department or the data department or whatever it might be. So these are sort of overstatements that they're sort of not, they don't sound like you, they don't feel authentic. These would be the same statements, but perhaps, through the lens of your actual experience as a student, as a graduate student, as a postdoc, right? And if you were to read these out loud, chances are they sound more like you're using language, right? So rather than cross-functional collaborations, it's just collaborations with faculty, postdocs, and, clinical staff, for example, right? It's the same illustration, but it's using language that makes sense. So although you're trying to update a little bit of your language to match the role, it has to feel like you in a meaningful way, right? So you don't have to read the whole bullet points. Usually when I'm going to share sort of content up here, they're just there for illustrations to give you an idea of what's going on, right? So first step, does it sound like you? And the answer, it should sound like you because you're going to have to be in an interview where you are expanding on the resume. When you're writing these bullet points, there are sort of 3 parts of each bullet point that you're going to write. The skill that you're highlighting that is relevant to the role, the context in which you use that skill, and the outcome that demonstrates how effective that skill is. That's sort of how you make one of those mini skills stories or mini skills statements that is a bullet point in a resume. The outcome is another area where sometimes people try to sort of create something because they've been told, bullet points should have outcomes. And so everyone's very focused on trying to find something quantifiable that you can focus on. So as an example, this is that example from the previous slide, right? So managed a 6-person team, resulting in a reduced sample turnaround time by about 20%, right? 20% there is your outcome. It's quantifiable. It feels tangible. It feels impactful. The word of caution I would give when you're using this type of language that feel, 20%, 40% increased efficiency, right, is that someone eventually may call you on it, right, in an interview, and they may say to you, well, how did you measure that? How did you come up with that number? What did you do? What process did you use to evaluate that? And if in an interview scenario you cannot, immediately describe the steps, the process, the reason why you chose that metric and how you, measured that, then you're going to take a step backwards. Your resume is going to sound more impressive than your interview answer, and that's not what you want to happen, right? You want your interview to build on the things that you're going to say in the resume. So a recruiter may not call you on this, but you have to be ready. If there's a number in your resume that you've created, especially an outcome, increased savings, time efficiency, whatever it might be, you need to have an answer that you need to have the ability to answer the questions that a recruiter might have about it. So again, it has to sound real. It has to be real because you're going to have to validate that in some cases. Now, there are two types of outcomes that you can sort of focus on, just as a semi-aside from what we're talking about here, right? So this is an example of a student consultant, PBG, right? They built this thing for a client, they built this Excel model. And in this first example, it increased, they talk about the project outcome. They were able to find data that showed or led to an increase in patient throughput by 6 to 8%. Again, you'd have to validate that 6 to 8%. What does that actually mean? But the outcome here is focused on the project, the context of the work that this person was doing for this client, which is okay. It's still an outcome, but it's very specific to that one project. The alternative version that I have on the bottom side here, it's the same example, but rather than being a project outcome, it's more of a skill outcome, right? The skill is building a novel Excel model. And the outcome is that was something that was used by the client for their planning meetings, right? So what they used it for, how they used it, that's less important for this particular story because the outcome is much more focused on the fact that building novel Excel models is a skill that this person is illustrating. So it's not that the top one is wrong and the bottom one is right. They're just different types of outcomes that you can think about as you are exploring your own skill stories. So we're into the territory of quantifying things, quantifying and qualifying, right? So quantifying are the numbers. Qualifying would be the descriptors, the way that you describe the nature of whatever's going on, right? So if we started with a bullet point like this, collaborated with a team on a research project examining public attitudes. So a team here is very not descriptive, right? Is it a team of 2? Is it a team of 32? A research project. What kind of research project? What kind of research are we talking about? Who's on the team, right? Is it a team of students or faculty or whatever it is, right? So there's not a lot of detail here. And the reader looking at this is not going to have a clear image in their mind of what is going on, right? So that's what you're trying to do with the resumes. You're trying to allow the reader to picture your skills in action, whereas this one doesn't quite create a very robust image. If we were to shift to this version, right? So it's much clearer now. So collaborated with a team of 2 graduate students and a faculty advisor. So that's 3 people total. Now, 3 is not better than 2, and 3 is not worse than 4, right? The number itself isn't as important as just there being a number, because as soon as there's a number, it makes the experience feel tangible, right? If you say you collaborated with a team, I have no image. If you say you collaborated with 3 people, I now have an image, right? And that image becomes more solid, and that's how I begin to see you, right? And they talk about a mixed methods study here. Worked with colleagues to develop a research proposal for a study. Again, colleagues to you makes sense. I may not know who your colleagues are, and I don't really know what worked means, right? Worked is a really non-descriptive verb. What are you doing today? Well, I'm working, right? It doesn't mean much by itself. So you want to obviously make that a little bit more qualified, as it were, so that people can understand what's going on. So in this case, what I did, or what this person did, is they facilitated a cross-disciplinary team. There are 4 different types of researchers, resulting in contributions from 3 co-authors that made into a draft, right? So again, there's numbers and there's qualifiers here that make that much more robust as an image. Analyze survey data to identify trends in voting behavior. Data are sort of a complex concept, right? So is it a lot of data? Is it variable data? Is it data with holes in it? Is it validated data? How much data are there, right? So there's a lot that can go into the word data to make it more meaningful. In this case, 1,200 survey responses. Again, 1,200 is not better than 1,000. 1,200 is not worse than 2,000. It's just what it is, and it makes it tangible and believable. Qualifiers here include the tools being used, right? So using the Stata software is qualifying the experience so that the reader has a better idea of what's going on. Conducted qualitative analysis of interviews. So again, as you're getting the idea here now, there are 35 interviews. And that resulted in 4 main themes as part of a final report, right? So again, the idea is not to write lots more, right? Because in a resume, you're limited by space. The idea is to be very strategic about which words allow the reader to picture the experience very clearly, right? Clearly enough that they could, talk about that experience to someone else. Hey, what was in that resume? Oh, this was a person who did X. Right, because the first bullet point, the conducted qualitative analysis, isn't really something that someone can run with and say, oh yeah, I read this great resume that had someone do this, right? Because it's just not enough context there to make that make sense. Okay, main takeaways of the resume. This is a question I sometimes ask people in a resume review appointment, right? I've read their resume and I say to them, what is it that you want the reader to walk away with having read this whole resume? Right? And sometimes people are somewhat surprised by that. It's like, well, I've never thought about that before. And really, that's what the document's trying to do, right? The document is trying to convince someone that you bring value. So what is that value? When people do give responses, sometimes it is, well, I want them to know that I have experience and a strong education background. That by itself, again, doesn't mean much, right? Because everyone applying for some of these roles is likely to have some combination of experience and education, right? So those broad concepts are not going to be enough. You need a little bit more detail. Now, there are 2 questions that we can ask about this to try to get into that, right? One is, can you look at your resume and identify the 3 to 5 main takeaways? Because again, you're complex, you've done lots of things. Coming up with one is sometimes hard. But can you identify the 3 or so main takeaways that you want the reader to have? The answer should be yes, right? And that those themes and those takeaways should be reinforced by what's in the document. The second question is, can you look at your resume and articulate the value that you in particular bring? You, not just the projects and the roles that you've had, but you, the type of person that you are. Have you reinforced something that's clear enough for them? So let's explore these 2 questions. The first one, the 3 to 5 takeaways, this is often what a summary does in a resume, right? And a summary is a really helpful starting point for a resume because it gives the reader what the conclusions are up front. And then as they read through the resume, they're like, oh, yes, I see that. I see that come to life, right? So the summary can be a very strategic tool to get the information across. Now, if you're doing resumes for consulting and it's a 1-page resume, sometimes it's hard to squeeze a summary onto a 1-page document because that's already a summary, right? So a summary doesn't work all the time, but it can be a really helpful tool. Even if you write it, and don't use it, it's helpful for you to know what that summary is. So again, this is just an example of what a summary could look like, right? So 5 years of experience turning open-ended questions into next steps, quantitative and qualitative skills, experience leading small teams, collaboration, data analysis, right? So all these are things that in the consulting realm would be value added. And the idea that a summary is going to be the conclusions. The body of the resume is where you're going to show those skills in action, right? So you're going to reinforce that. The other question, what kind of person are you? What do you bring to this equation? These are just examples of what a theme might be that represents the type of person that you are, right? I would call myself, for example, someone who brings a lot of creativity to a role. So creative thinking or creative problem solving. These are the types of things that I would define myself, that I would want my resume to sort of reinforce. These are just examples, right? And it may be that you see yourself in multiple of these, and that's probably true because you can play slightly different roles. But it is helpful to know what your theme might be, right? Or the themes that you want to associate with, because you can reinforce those in a resume. So if we take the example of leading teams through ambiguity, right? So the ability that you can manage people and make a complex problem or a project easy when you are helping people navigate that, as a team leader or in settings where you're collaborating with other people. So if that's the theme, these bullet points here across 3 different experiences would reinforce that theme, right? So the theme is leading small teams through ambiguity. In each of these bullet points, I led a 4-person team on a project, clarifying a vague question that the client had so that we came up with an outcome. I organized a project with 5 people. Even though we didn't have a question in mind, I was able to come up with one as part of that team and we had an outcome. I help TAs navigate a new course or a course with changing content, right? So each of these reinforces the idea that you can lead teams through ambiguity. Now, that again, leading teams through ambiguity is not necessarily the thing that you need to demonstrate, but in this case, if that's how you see yourself, you would want to make sure that your resume reinforces that. So these are just ways to sort of help make sure that there's clear messaging in your documents. Questions you can ask about your bullet points. You've written all your bullet points. Let's start first of all with, again, what consulting firms are looking for in an ideal candidate, right? So these are just an example of some of the skill sets, broad as they may be, that a consulting firm, a hiring manager, recruiter at a consulting firm is looking for in your resume. So the bullet points should speak to some of these areas, right? Because again, the consulting job description is not detailed. It's not like a 3-page, research role at Merck where they have everything that this person's going to be doing. Consulting is vague by nature, but these are the skills that usually bubble up in terms of someone saying, these are what we're looking for. So when you write your bullets, you should be laser focused on trying to match some of those skills. Again, this is an example, a data intern at a random company, right? These are good, clear bullet points that someone has written about what they did as an intern at this company. They clean and merge cell data sets, they built dashboards, they wrote some Python scripts, right? Perfectly good bullet points. If we sort of take this first one, just as an example, these then are the 3 questions that I would have people ask about their bullet points, right? So if you have, 20 bullet points in your resume, a bit more, for each one of those bullet points, you can run through this process. The first question, what is it that you want the reader to walk away with having read that specific bullet point? What is the main takeaway for them, right? Because if you don't know what the takeaway is from a bullet point, the reader's going to have no idea, right? Because they weren't there, they didn't live that experience. So you have to be super clear on what that's going to be. The next question after writing after answering that question is that takeaway that you've come up with relevant to the role that you're applying to? Does that speak somehow to the role that you're applying to? Because if you're saying, this is the takeaway that I want you to have, but the reader's like, I don't care about that takeaway, then there may be a bit of a disconnect there. The third question, once you've figured out whether it's relevant or changed it so it is relevant, is, have you actually described it in enough words that the reader can understand it and picture it? Because what happens when you read your own bullet points is that your brain fills in the gaps, and it makes immediately more sense to you than it does to the reader, right? The reader only has the words, you have all the context of that. Your brain remembers everything. So it's always going to sound like it makes more sense to you when you read it. So let's take an example of how to answer these questions and what that might look like going through, right? So what is it that you want the reader to walk away with having read this bullet point? The bullet point is worked on a project with a nonprofit client. Again, it's a very broad, vague bullet point, but it's a good example because there is no clear takeaway here, right? What is the takeaway? Well, I worked on a project, right? But that's not really a sort of a key conclusion that would bring value to a role. So that's not going to be something that's going to be helpful. Now, you can make it much more specific about what that project looked like. I analyze records in Excel to identify these things, giving them a next step as part of their project, right? So if this was a consulting project with a client, for example. So at least in this case, the takeaway that you might say I want to have is that I can take data and I can do something with it. I can take complex data and I can come up with clear recommendations, right? That might be the takeaway from this experience. Let's take another bullet point, right? But the question now is the takeaway from this bullet point relevant to the reader, relevant to the role that you're applying to? So in consulting resumes, there's often a sort of a leadership experience section that people like to have. And I think it's a great section to have. In that leadership experience, you might be the chair of a social group or a student group, right? And as part of your role as chair, you do a lot of event management and logistics. And so, yes, you organized social events. Maybe you're the part of the departmental student group, right? And you order social events. And I've seen bullet points just like this, where people talk about the types of events that they organized. The challenge here is that even though this is leadership experience, it doesn't really have a relevant takeaway to a role, right? Organizing social events is not something that you're going to be doing as a consultant. So the skill here, the skill that's identified is not transferable. So let's sort of make it a little bit more meaningful. Whilst not losing what happened as part of this role, the second one, right, you're planning and budgeting events, but it includes things that perhaps are more important, right? Negotiating with vendors. You are maximizing the impact of events, right? Your planning led to greater events. You have a way of strategically identifying how to improve something, right? So maybe it's improving the attendance, or maybe it's engaging with the clients, stakeholders, whoever they might be. That is the main takeaway there. The fact that it was about social events, that becomes the context of the other skills that are more transferable, right? So another sort of focus on the idea that even for leadership skills, the skills that you identify should feel like they're relevant to the world of consulting. Have you included the right number of words, right? So again, this is an unclear takeaway. I built a model to help my supervisor with forecasting simply because when you read this, if this was your project, you would know exactly what happened, what model you used, what data there were, what challenges you faced. The reader has none of that. So your brain says, yes, this makes sense. My brain says, I don't know what this is. So, you would expand on it if you wanted to make this bullet point more meaningful, to provide enough imagery, enough context, enough quantifiers and qualifiers for the reader to experience the same image in their head as you have in your head. Right? So just a few examples then of how those questions can help. Our last resume tip then is using AI as part of this process, right? So in all things, cover letters and resumes, I would never have AI write your resume for you. I'd never put in a resume that you've written and just say, change this for this new job, or, here's my LinkedIn profile, make a resume out of it. Because the AI tools don't know you. They don't know you well enough. They're going to miss all the nuances. But you can certainly brainstorm with them, right? You can certainly give them roles, play the role of a coach, a resume coach, and do these things for me, right? So help me identify whether I've quantified my outcomes and ask me questions about those. Help me identify whether I've touched on people skills, project skills, problem-solving skills, right? Make sure that those come to life. Help me draw conclusions from my resume and suggest, outcomes or summary statements that I can use. So this is just one set of prompts to give you an example. This is a sort of a 5-stage set of prompts that you can use. Again, there are a million prompts out there. You can make your own prompts, but I just give you an example of what these look like. First of all, leverage the job description for any information that's included in there. Consulting job descriptions are notoriously unhelpful simply because they're so vague, but you can do this for any other jobs. Secondly, you make sure that you have identified and told strong stories about the skills that you're identifying, right? So make sure that your skills are a good match for whatever that job is or what you know about that job. Make sure that the descriptions of the skills that you have really speak to the skills, right? So, sorry, the descriptions of the experiences really speak to those, and then sort of, go through each one and ask those questions and make sure that they are relevant. Ask the AI tool to be a hiring manager. If you're the hiring manager, what pops out first? What do you see? What are the main themes that arise, right? Everyone's going to see something different, but you want to get a sense of what is the takeaway from someone else's perspective. And then make sure that you're really sort of clarifying and finalizing some of those bullet points. Again, I just share this as examples of the million prompts that you can use, but none of these actually involve the AI tool writing a document for you. They just help you navigate through that. Okay, so that's the resume side. That's our foundation. We're going to touch on the resumes as we talk about the cover letters because there's an interaction between these two documents, as I mentioned. So what is that interaction? Let's talk about sort of the way these things are set up. Resumes, skills focused, right? They're punchy bullet points. Did this, use this skill, gain this knowledge, use this knowledge, right? So they're very factual based. They're very objective. If you read too many resumes in a row, they're kind of boring after a while because, again, they're just lists of things, right? There's not really a story there. But there are wonderful keywords, and it's going to be the main document that everyone's going to read, right? They may not read a cover letter. You don't know who's going to read a cover letter, but you know everyone's going to read a resume. So what does a cover letter do, right? A cover letter expands on what you've covered in the resume, right? Remembering that everything in the cover letter needs to be echoed by something in the resume, but not everything in the resume will end up in a cover letter, right? The cover letter is the best, most relevant aspects, but it's also a little bit more about you, right? The cover letter gives me, if I'm reading a good cover letter, a sense of the type of person that you are, the way that you approach work that you do, and why you think your experience is a good match, and why you even want the role that you're applying to, right? So it's more of a why document than a sort of a what document, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well. Your LinkedIn profile is sort of an intermediate between these things, right? And LinkedIn can be a great place to have a little bit of narrative, a little bit of stories, a few bullet points here, but a multimedia approach where you can show some of your work in action. each of these adds to the puzzle. They should each focus on something slightly different as part of your narrative, even though they're reinforcing the same things. So all the skills, definitely want those in the resume. Specific stories that jump out from your experience that really highlight those skills, it's going to be the cover letter. Demonstrations of your skills in action and your ability to, if you post things on LinkedIn, that's going to give me a sense of your energy or motivation around something, because that's something that you can be doing in real time. What do people think about cover letters? This is, I think, an important one because there are a million hiring managers, and the landscape of consulting firms is very broad. So, what does everyone think about cover letters? Well, if you go on LinkedIn and you sort of search for cover letters, you're going to get different types of feedback, right? So, Jeff here hates cover letters. Cover letters are a pointless waste of time. He's angry about cover letters. He's going to die on this hill of cover letters. He never wants to see a cover letter. And then Josh says, no, I totally disagree with that. Cover letters are great. Right? So immediately we're creating this sort of giant spectrum of people who are going to be on one end, the other end, and all the way in the middle, right? Different perspectives on cover letters. As a hiring manager, I won't read them. In my opinion, they're a waste of time. Cover letters are an absolute must for me. I will always read them. They're going to make my decision easier in terms of interviewing. So again, very different perspectives. Now, things to bear in mind about the cover letters, right, is in our modern day where AI tools are being used not just to scan for keywords in resumes, which is the old style applicant tracking software, with our current sort of AI tools, anything that you send to a recruiter, the resume, the cover letter, your LinkedIn profile, can be sort of scanned by an AI tool, the information extracted, and that can be used to build a more robust candidate profile about you. So a strong cover letter that tells me more information, that adds to the information that you've shared in the resume, is going to give the AI tools more information to draw conclusions about the value that you bring. Right? So it's another way to get information into the robots to help them advocate for you. And the same thing with humans, right? You're going to give them more information. Someone who reads the cover letter is going to know you more, know you better, and appreciate the value that you can potentially bring to the organization. So as I mentioned, cover letters are why documents, right? Why do you want this job? Why are your skills relevant? Why are you a good fit? Why are you even doing this given that you've done 7 years of something totally different, right? So there's lots of questions that you're trying to get. It's not just a why document, but it's trying to get at some of those elements. And as I mentioned here, it's a more personal document because it's more narrative. And what I mean by more narrative is rather than just having a punchy 1-line or 2-line bullet point, manage team of 5 people to do X and Y, there's room in a paragraph in the cover letter to tell a mini story. And stories are powerful because people remember stories more than they remember lists of bullet points, right? You can give them 30 bullet points, and after a while, the brain tunes them out. But you tell one good story, and people go, oh, that's good. And if I go home after reading a bunch of resumes and cover letters, and tell my partner about what I've read, I'm going to talk about sort of the experiential part of it, not the bullet points, but something that stands out from that person's experience. The other day, my team met with a McKinsey recruiter who's in charge of their advanced degree hiring. Right, we were talking about the McKinsey Insight process, and we're going to be sharing information about that. And my colleague Diane asked the recruiter directly, "Do you read cover letters?" Right, we get a question a lot from students: "Do you read cover letters?" And the recruiter said, "No, we do not read cover letters." Now, I'm hoping that they don't ask for cover letters. I don't know what McKinsey's application looks like, but I'm hoping they don't ask for it. But this was a very, very clear statement. Now, they said, we do read resumes. And what they meant by that is they don't use AI tools to pass through resumes, right? They do spend a lot of time reading through each of the resumes that they're looking at, them and their team. Now, this no is not a blanket no for all consulting firms, right? There's a whole wide range of firms, each with a different type of culture, different type of hiring process, different focus, big ones, small ones, life science, healthcare, whatever it might be. And so McKinsey's no is not a universal no. But it is important to know if you're a PhD and applying for an advanced degree hiring McKinsey, you probably can get away without the cover letter. But elsewhere, where they do ask for it, you need a strong, robust cover letter. So then here are going to be my 5 tips for cover letters. Again, they're going to feel a little bit sort of cryptic right now, but cover letters are important because they make you make sense. Cover letters are important because they add to the bullets in a resume with stories. They provide energy over the facts of the resume. They explain the why over the what, and they can illustrate your proactiveness rather than just sounding generic. So those are our themes. Let's get to it. So why you make sense? We're going to go back to this list that we had for resumes, right? I said, what's the main theme that identifies you in a resume? Can you identify that? Can you reinforce that through bullet points? So let's take another one. We talked about leading small teams through ambiguity in that last example. Let's use this same thematic list and talk about turning messy problems into clear structured plans, right? If that's you, if that's the version of you that you want to get across, cover letters can very quickly support that and reinforce that, right? So I'm applying for the position of a associate consultant at the company that was advertised on Handshake. I have a PhD in this, I'm studying this. Throughout my career, I've gravitated towards roles where I can take complex, unstructured problems and turn them into actionable insights. So in a sort of a narrative document, you can make that statement, right? It's not a bullet point, it's a statement of intent about who you are and what you bring. In this opening paragraph, then, or this probably a second paragraph of a cover letter, this second paragraph, or the top paragraph here, gives a nice overview then of some of those areas, right? In my PhD work, that means learning new things. I've also enjoyed this as part of my role in PGCC, right? As part of the consulting club there. What happens next in this sort of structure is that there's an example that supports that. For example, I led this project. We understand this. The main challenge was that nothing was standardized. We couldn't compare programs and so on and so on, right? So this example here is going to support the narrative that you can take unstructured data and turn them into clear insights. So I know that you can do it from your research. I know that you can do it from your consulting club. And now you give me an example to support that. The cover letter is immediately establishing the validity of your theme and supporting the bullet points that you might have in the resume. Now, if we take this example, right, so this is the example that I just talked about in that last slide. What you might notice is that this is basically a STAR story, right? If you've done an interviewing workshop or read about interviewing strategy, STAR: situation, task, action, result. In a behavioral-based interview, and someone says, give me an example of a time where you collaborated, you're going to tell a STAR story to structure your answer. In the cover letter, you're telling mini STAR stories, right? You're giving some background, you're identifying the challenge, the drama, right? So I always prefer challenge as opposed to task for the STAR model, but then it becomes the SCAR model and it sounds less appealing. But the challenge adds the tension and the drama, right? So the challenge is there was nothing standardized. Nothing existed. There was no framework to start. And that sets the tension in the story. That sounds terrible. What did you do? And then the rest of the example talks about the action and the outcome. So cover letters include examples that are STAR stories. And that's a good way of sort of beginning to think about how you can use your cover letters effectively. So we're straight into stories, right? So let's talk about bullets and stories here. This is 3 random bullet points from a resume, right? Again, perfectly good bullet points, led a team and a graduate club, consolidated data, built an Excel model, right? These are sort of very similar bullet points throughout this presentation. What's important to note about a bullet point in a resume is that each bullet point is basically a standalone story, right? You shouldn't have to read 4 bullet points to understand everything. It's not a sequential list of, I did this, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. That requires the reader to hold on to information in their sort of memory and then sort of read the next bullet point. You want each bullet point to be standalone so that if I just took out one bullet point, it would illustrate a skill with some context and an outcome. The other thing about these bullet points, as I sort of just mentioned in the last one, is that there's no drama or tension here. The energy is fairly flat. I did this thing that resulted in this thing, right? It's sort of there's nothing that really makes that a story. If I were to, go back to the example that we have before, this story that I told in that previous slide expands on these bullet points, right? So what I'm listing as part of this story are the same experiences in this bullet point, in these bullet points. So this is important because a cover letter doesn't repeat what the resume says. It adds layers onto what you say in the resume, right? So a bullet point says, I did all these things, but in the cover letter, the story is more about the challenge, right? The main challenge is that nothing was standardized, so we had to build this afresh, right? That's not something that's going to come across in the bullet points because that requires a little bit of a setup in order for that to make sense, right? So these bullet points in a resume can lead to this story in the cover letter. And if I read the resume and then the cover letter, I now have a better picture of your experience, a better idea about how you manage problems and challenges than I did before, right? That if I just read the resume, I wouldn't have the same type of information that I do now. The other aspect of the stories is that you want to add an energy, right? So again, a cover letter for consulting roles, pretty much for any role, is going to be one page, pretty much a firm limit there to make sure that you can illustrate concise communication. In that one-page letter, you have to keep the reader engaged with information that's new, that sort of adds value to the resume, but also with energy, because reading, again, 30 cover letters can get quite draining because they basically say the same thing in slightly different ways. So if you add a sense of energy, it's going to be helpful. So again, going back, it's the same example we talked about. You have to read it, but it's the same example. If you look at this example, and I asked the question, this is your example, I said, but did you actually enjoy this project? This example doesn't answer that question, right? There's no sense that this was a positive experience, that you found it satisfying, that it was exciting. Yes, there was a challenge, but solving that challenge didn't necessarily come across here as being something positive, right? You didn't frame it in that way. So, and that's something that the resume does, that the cover letter does very well. So if you wanted to, you could add any one of these lines onto the end of the story to add a sense of energy, right? These are all examples of how to energize a narrative in the document. So I did all these things, and it was really satisfying to take this complex data and do something with it. I did all these things, and I thought we were going to struggle because it was really hard to do it to begin with, but it was gratifying that our hard work paid off, and the senior data analyst said so. I did this thing and I found it energizing because I had to do it so quickly and it was fast paced and I enjoyed that. I did this thing and I enjoyed doing it as part of a team, right? So each of these statements adds an energy, sort of an emotional state, a subjective state that is important to the story, but it tells me something about how you think, how you feel, how you work in that setting. Here's another example, right? So this is a different example now. So the first paragraph is sort of a broad paragraph that explains the theme of the cover letter. So you can imagine this is the body paragraph in the cover letter. I've always sought out data analytics projects, roles when I can bring insights to life. With 5 years of experience in data analytics, I've done all these things. I've used these tools. In a recent role, I did these things as well, right? And then the example below is the story, right? One of my most challenging and rewarding projects was the development of this machine learning pipeline. Our team lacked this thing. That's the challenge. So what I did is this. If we break this apart, you're going to see how this sort of works, right? So this first paragraph, this is the theme. You're touching on the idea that data analytics is a strength for this person. And that theme also touches on the fact that this person is proactive. They have the ability to be innovative. They have knowledge of these skills, right? So even though you're highlighting one theme, there's other concepts that you can add into that. So that's, part one, that's the sort of setting the stage for the example. Part two then is the star story, right? So again, each of this paragraph can be broken into those elements of the star story: situation, task, action, result, or situation, challenge, action, result. But there's also language in here that's energizing, right? One of my most rewarding projects. I thoroughly enjoyed the fast-paced problem solving, right? So now you're associating enjoyment and positive feelings with a fast-paced environment. And if the job that you're applying to is a fast-paced environment, you're telling the reader you're going to enjoy that environment, right? You're framing the fact that it's a good fit for you. And this has been part of a highly impactful and fun partnership. The word fun there is a little bit playful, right? But again, you might have found that fun in some way, enjoyable, and you're just trying to keep that energy there. When people read energizing language, they become more energized, right? So it sort of awakes part of your brain, and that energizing language can make it more meaningful to the reader. So these are examples of things that you can get away with saying in a cover letter that just don't work in a resume, right? You can't say in a resume as a bullet point, excitedly collaborated with 4 people, right? It just doesn't make any sense to do it in the resume because it's just a very dry, objective approach. But these are examples of the type of energy statements that can add to a cover letter so that the reader feels engaged by you, sees how you think and feel, because that's going to help them determine if this is a role that's going to be a good fit for you as they think about how your skills and knowledge and experience brings value to that role. Okay, the what versus, sorry, the what or the how, which is the resume versus the why. Your resume never actually says why you want to be a consultant, right? It's sort of, here are the skills that I have, here's what I can do, here's what I can bring. Ideally, what you bring is what a consultant does. So you're saying, I want to be a consultant because I can do the role, but you don't actually say why. Why is this a good fit for you? Your cover letter obviously can say that. So in a cover letter, I've broken down the cover letter into sort of four main sections here: the introduction paragraph, the summary, a couple of body paragraphs, and then the final paragraph. Why this job? Why this company? Why this organization? Right? That's sort of where I think is a good place to situate the answer to that question. What you bring takes up about 2/3 or 3/4 of the letter. What you want or what you want to walk away with is that last paragraph. That's a good way of weighting the experience. But you can be very direct in terms of what that looks like. So the opening paragraph, the summary paragraph, tells the reader why you want to be a consultant in this case, because it highlights the fact that what you do well is what consultants do well, what the role requires you to do well. So in this case, breaking down complex, ambiguous questions into clear, results. And I've done that through my dissertation. I've done that through a consulting club, and I've done that in different areas, right? And so I have what you're looking for, and I want to bring that to bear, right? So why do you want this job? Because I can do the job. That's what your first paragraph is going to say there. The last paragraph is where you're going to be a little bit more obviously focused on each individual employer that you're excited by. Right? I'm excited by this role at LEK because it combines two things I enjoy: working on complex data and using influencing real world decisions, or focusing on the healthcare situation, right? Whatever it is. So again, enjoy is a active language. It's an energizing language there. This should feel authentic, right? This explains why you want to be a consultant and why you want to be a consultant at LEK. And obviously you have to write one that's authentic to each consulting firm that you apply to that wants a cover letter from you. You have to be equally as authentic for each of them and not just use generic language. But this is a nice way of demonstrating why it's a good fit, right? So you've demonstrated in the first 2/3 of the letter that you have what they're looking for. You've told them that you have it. You've shown it in action with examples. The last paragraph is saying, because I have all this, and because LEK does this in a certain way, I'm really excited that this is a good place where I can continue to use these skills, knowledge, and experience. Generic versus proactive. What I mean by this is that, if you get an AI tool to write a cover letter, it's going to sound very generic. If you say to an AI tool, why would I want to work at LEK? It's going to come up with a generic answer. There's a lot of things that you can do proactively outside of writing a resume and cover letter that are going to help you be a little bit more proactive sounding. So in these two examples, these are, the ending paragraphs of a cover letter for this LEK role. I've integrated things that the candidate has done beyond just writing the letter, beyond just putting the resume together, that illustrates that they've been proactive, and that feels like to the hiring manager or the recruiter that they are closer, they feel closer to the organization. So you meet someone at a career fair, you remember to take their name down, right? They're all wearing name badges. You take that name, you can name drop that person in a cover letter, right? It makes you feel like you took the steps to reach out to someone, have a conversation. That makes you feel more proactive. It also gives you more authentic things to talk about. So why do you want to work at LEK? Well, you want to work there because they're going to pay you and they do good stuff. But also, hearing that they do X and Y is something that actually does make you more interested, right? So the more you talk to people, the more information that you would have to sort of say, well, that's why I want to work there too, right? So that's version 1. Version 2, you're doing informational interviews, you're reaching out to alumni, you're asking them questions about their background. The more you hear about them say what they like, the more you can say, I like that too, right? They mentioned how they like this. That's great because I like that. Again, this is unique to you, unique to your experience, unique to that situation where you had this conversation with this one person. So it's not generic, it's not boilerplate, it's specific to the experience that you have. So again, that's going to be important. Now this works because in this pyramid of how to write resumes and cover letters, hopefully you're spending a lot of time building connections with people, right? You're doing the networking, you're connecting with people at info sessions, at career fairs, you're doing informational interviews. All of that's going to make writing resumes easier. All of that is going to make writing your cover letters easier. And that's a key part of it, right? The writing is just the tip of the iceberg. Doing all this other background information is going to be helpful as part of that. I shared 5 tips for using AI with resumes. Here's 5 for cover letters. Again, I would always write the cover letter first before you start throwing it at AI. But then say, what just sounds weird? What sounds like it's not my tone of voice? What sounds too formal? Sometimes people write very formal cover letters. And again, I would say that when you read your cover letter out loud, it should sound just like you, professional you, right? It should sound like the best professional version of you, but it should sound like you. So that's a good thing to do. Um, Identify what comes out of this cover letter, right? What does the cover letter say about me? What are the themes that come from the cover letter, right? What these number 2 and 3 doing here, making sure that your themes, what you want to come across, are also what the cover letter is getting across. So double checking that. Compare the cover letter and the resume for alignment. Make sure, again, that the cover letter is building off the resume, not just repeating the same thing. If you say the same thing in the resume as you do in the cover letter, it makes it more boring. If I read the same thing twice, it doesn't make it more impactful. It makes it less impactful because now my brain starts turning off. And then if you have trouble with that summary paragraph, the opening paragraph, write the body paragraphs first and then say, help me craft a summary that sort of pulls everything together. Because that introductory paragraph should signpost all the things that you're going to expand on in the body paragraphs. We talked about networking as being a key part of what you're doing when you're preparing to write cover letters and resumes. So we have our informational interviewing guide. We have our resume guide, right? So with examples and AI prompts and all the things in there. So you can take a look at that. It's going to give you some examples of how to position it and what the different sections look like. That's going to be a key guide for that as well. The Career Services website has Learn How to Build Effective Resumes. So under the Learn How to drop down here on the top, you can do resumes, and there's samples of resumes there that you can take a look at. There's also Learn How to Write Effective Cover Letters, where we provide a few more bits of information about that. There's no one way of doing this, but this is a great set of resources that you can take a look at there. Beyond Graduate School, a platform for master students exploring the world of work around them, has a How to Write a Resume workshop, also has a How to Write a Cover Letter one, which I've highlighted in the red circle there. So that's a tool that you can access, a great resource for every aspect of the job search process. For PhD students, the PhD Career Training Platform, or Beyond the Professoriate platform, has a resume workshop and a cover letter one, so similar topics there that you can take a look at. If you're a PhD in the humanities and social sciences, they have a job families sort of set of resources. One of those is applying for consulting roles as a humanities and social sciences PhD or postdoc, and they have sample resumes and sample cover letters for applying for consulting that you can take a look at.